Now, many people amongst us, of course, shop at Kmart, so any news around it generally will be used to get some attention, but it's not the attention that anyone's going to be wanting here. I go to the West Australian, but there's lots of other places reporting this tonight, that Kmart is defending its ethical sourcing program amid Uyghur forced labour allegations. Now, follow the bouncing ball here, but the Australian Uyghurs Women's Association has filed legal action in the federal court to compel Kmart to produce documents showing what it knows about two of its clothing suppliers listed on its 2024 and 2025 factory lists. Why does it matter? Because it claims these suppliers have links to the autonomous region where, of course, Uyghurs are being held captive in China, where the claim is of systematic state-sponsored forced labour of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities is allegedly taking place. Now, Kmart has responded, so in fairness to them, I will read from a Kmart spokeswoman talking to the Western Australian newspaper, or the West Australian newspaper, I should say, has said that it has invited the people making the allegations several times to discuss concerns. The West Australian understands the group have never agreed to a meeting. The Kmart spokeswoman said it was committed to respecting human rights in its operations and supply chains. Compliance with our ethical sourcing code is required under our contracts with suppliers. Suppliers in the Kmart ethical sourcing program are regularly monitored through activities including our site visits, audit programs and investigations if we receive any reports or complaints of concern. Now, why am I talking about this now? Because a group of people believe it is significant enough a claim to potentially take into a court and try to adjudicate about whether the forced labour which is taking place in parts of China is being used in places like Australia. Again, you've seen the denials. But it brings us to a bigger issue, one that is very much on the front lines of what sort of a country we are and the policies, and at times the blind loyalty to the policies of this federal government. Now, as you know, it has been reported by multiple media organisations, including this photo comes from the Bloomberg news agency in the United States, about the Uyghur population being singled out and placed into essentially forced labour camps. As the New York Post reported on, they reported here again on these prison camps in that particular area of China. Now, interestingly, this reporting still continues because while the Pulitzer Centre reports as late as this year that China's economy is running on Uyghur forced labour, a particular version of alleged Uyghur forced labour is something that has been of great interest to me for a long time. And it is to make sure that Australia is not part of the demand, where the supply chain is being met with the abuse of human beings. That far right-wing outlet, the BBC, has been relentless in their reporting on this issue. And again, I show you their reporting here, which claims that China uses Uyghur forced labour to make solar panels. Now, this story is a couple of years old, yet has been reinforced by multiple organisations over multiple years. And as the largest exporter of solar panels around the world, how China makes them and who is being forced to make them matters. Now, believe it or not, Joe Biden may have got only one thing right in his time as President of the United States, but it was for the United States to block and ban any shipments of solar panels coming from potential Chinese slave labour camps. The UK has also decided to move legislation to put a ban on solar panels being linked to Chinese slavery. Now, we know on many issues, there are plenty of people in and around Australian politics who say, well, if countries like America are doing it, we should do it. That works for both the left and the right, depending on the issue. People say because the United Kingdom is headed in a certain direction, this is the way Australia should go. And yes, while Australia, we constantly are reminded by the Prime Minister, when it counts, is a sovereign nation, unbelievably, Australia has not banned the importation of said solar panels which are allegedly being made by the slave labour of this religious minority. The Prime Minister and his Climate Change Minister have signed documents and even thrown billions of dollars of taxpayers' money at trying to get to a more than 80% of our energy grid by 2030 being renewables, with the largest source of those renewables, or a very significant source of those, being some 20,000 solar panels that are required each and every day. But as you know, they are at this moment failing to meet the targets of 5 years away in terms of renewable energy. There are some complicated and not so complicated reasons about it, but put simply, for us to be any chance of hitting this target, we're going to need an awful lot more wind farms, we're going to need an awful lot more big batteries, and we're going to need a lot more solar panels. And yes, the federal government is trying to move some money to make sure that some of these can be made here, but the reality is the biggest source of solar panels going around the world is coming from China, and the biggest source of where they are coming from in China is the alleged slave labour that, again, multiple media organisations with deeper resources than this program have been reporting those facts. The local Uyghur population is furious that Australia has not taken a stance on this issue. I'd love to know why. And while I know that the Teal Independents would not take any advice from me, perhaps they should meet with these organisations that are based in Australia. Perhaps the Greens, who without their support nothing can pass the parliament, they should be engaging on this issue. It is not a way of trying to disenfranchise the local Chinese diaspora. It is about saying that Australia will not be using billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to increase and exponentially increase the importation of goods that have been made in this questionable fashion. To me, it is a line in the sand. In fact, again, the reporting remains relentless, including this story from just last year: the sinister reality behind cheap solar panels and EVs being imported into Australia. The source of that claim is the very same group that were making their claims about the shopping giant a little bit earlier in the program. But put simply, regardless of whether you are all in on renewable energy or you think that there's a better way of doing something, surely everyone agrees that we must ban the importation of these things made by slave labour. No one will ask a question in Canberra, so I can simply say to you watching, ask your local member, what is their position on this issue? Ask a senator, ask a minister, write to the Prime Minister. Be respectful, do not be abusive, but simply ask, will Australia ban the importation of solar panels from China that have potential links to slave labour? I would love to know the answer that they give you. Now, one of the myths about Australia is that we have free speech. We have a version of it, but of course it's not written in a Bill of Rights, it's not written into a constitution, and the combination of parliaments and courts have certainly drawn a big box around what you can and can't say. Certainly what I am able to say on television or listen to via Sky News Radio is very different than what some people are allowed to get away with in the Wild West that is the internet. But the reality is that free speech is policed by courts from the laws made by Parliament and even at times by the keyboard warriors who deem things to be appropriate or not appropriate. But strangely, the thing that no one will say is that your right to free speech is not absolute in this country. Now, I do not want the right to make other people feel terrible. I do not want the rules in and around discrimination to be turned away, and I certainly don't want the ability to defame people to become instantly available. But it would be fascinating if a senator anywhere watching us, the next time Parliament was around, tried to move a one-sentence motion. Australians have a right to free speech. I would love to see what happens in a free vote in the Senate. Would they even engage in the debate? It would be fascinating to see where the major parties go, who would be willing to break ranks, who would be willing to cross the floor to affirm whether Australia has a right to free speech or not. And all of this is interesting to me, not just because I do my best to practice it and hopefully you enjoy it each and every night, and we have been together for a long time now, but it's to talk about the person who has a responsibility about whom comes into the country or who is booted out of the country. Tony Burke is the Home Affairs Minister. He is the one who has replaced some early terrible choices by this Albanese government, and he's a man who is significant to Anthony Albanese for a collection of different reasons. But one of his responsibilities is to overrule visas that are given to whom they declare to be the wrong people, or to remove the visas of people who've done the wrong thing when they are here. A power that is important because you have to have someone somewhere who we can hold responsible when the wrong type of people are in the country. We have enough of a problem of the people whom have already been born here, at times saying the most despicable and vile things. But I couldn't quite believe the words that came out of the Home Affairs Minister, a minister in supposedly an open and free democracy in a Western country like Australia. Because Tony Burke gave this interview to the Australian Financial Review. He is talking about how, for him, he does not care about the issue of free speech when it comes to things like social cohesion and making sure that people are not given visas to come into the country who are going to disrupt it. Since being appointed Home Affairs Minister in late July 2024, Burke says that he has directed his department to prioritise social cohesion when processing visa application and considering cancellations. Direct quote. There's traditionally been a large number of people where the power to refuse was clearly there. In the name of freedom of speech, ministers have said, oh no, let them in. Quote, I could not care less about the freedom of speech argument. Repeat, I could not care less about the freedom of speech argument if I'm in the business of stopping hatred from being imported into Australia. Now again, this is where it becomes complicated. If you are truly a free speech advocate, then you are advocating for the right of people to say the things that you detest. Obviously, I do not suggest that people should be able to come into the country and spew hate, no question. But the idea that the free speech part of the equation has just been tossed aside by this government is, to me, extraordinary. And also, it seems to be a little bit inconsistent with the way that things have worked since the election of this government 3 years ago. Because foreign hate preachers have been able to come and go from this country. Why were their visas approved at all, when a simple Google search would be able to tell you what is most likely to be said during their time in Australia? Now, of course, a country without a border is not a country. I want a strong border. I want borders to be policed. But I don't take any comfort from, again, an elected government in a so-called free country like Australia saying free speech, who cares? Again, I could not care less about the freedom of speech argument if I'm in the business of stopping hatred from being imported into Australia. Now, the other issue is that Tony Burke is responsible for whether certain performers are allowed to come into the country given visas or not. And there are plenty of examples over the past 3 years, and a look at the events coming up in the next couple of years in the country, where some people with some fairly dodgy pasts, some pretty sketchy personal lives, and at the very least borderline about whether they're savoury or unsavoury characters, are being let into the country. Now, is this because they have a right to the freedom of expression through their art, through their music, through their stand-up comedy, through their speaking tours? Well, again, this is where it gets complicated. But the thing that really concerns me about this is that Tony Burke has two jobs in the federal government. One is to say freedom of speech doesn't matter because I'm the person in charge of who gets to come in and who gets to leave. But his second job is that he is the Arts Minister of Australia. You would think that there could be no greater conflict than an artistic community who wants nothing but free speech, including, yes, at times, the right to offend, and a person saying that free speech doesn't matter when I'm deciding who's coming into the country. On what basis will he let in a hate preacher but knock back a writer, a performer, or a speaker that he disagrees with? You see, these are issues which will always come up case by case, but you are designing a problem when the person who represents the artistic community in the federal government is the same person, I repeat for the how manyth time, is saying he doesn't care about free speech when it comes to those who can come and go from the country. Keen to know what yours are, your thoughts on the free speech. Can the bloke do both jobs? Send me an email tonight, paul@skynews.com.au. Now, to another version of free speech, which has been quite controversial over the past few days, and that is the protests on the Harbour Bridge. Now, as we know, plenty of people have had plenty to say. My extensive comments were made on Sunday night, which is why you should always be here. The highlights are up at skynews.com.au, and I go into some conversation about that. But the one thing that is indisputable is that an awful lot of police were required to deal with the crowds that were there. We hear tonight, via the really wonderful reporting of Sherry Markson, that the unsavoury characters who were holding up, among other things, swastikas or terrorist flags are now being investigated, but of course could well have been intercepted during the march. But the decision was made not to intercept. The decision has also been made by the New South Wales government, I understand, that there will be no bill presented to those protest organisers, despite the fact that there were a great deal of extra work for those officers to deal with that crowd, despite the fact that the police themselves had turned around and said no. And generally speaking, when extra police are required to something that they were not planning to attend, you get sent a bill. I've spoken about this uphill and down Dale, and I'll talk about it tonight with Nigel Farage, our special guest, a little bit later in the show, because when it was he whom the police decided needed extra security for his event, he was sent the bill. No bill will be sent to clearly more officers being required to deal with what happened on Sunday. For his part, a contribution of a bloke who will never be the Premier of New South Wales, but still worth paying attention to because he is the opposition leader in New South Wales, Mark Speakman, came up with an idea here to try to form some sort of a balance between, yes, your right to protest, but not your right to continuously ignore law enforcement and being indifferent to the consequences of what protests you are taking place. He said today, the right to protest is fundamental in a liberal democracy, but it's not an absolute right. In many ways, look back to the previous conversation around free speech. Yeah, we've got free speech, but it has to be balanced against public safety, against the diversion of police resources, against the cost to the taxpayer, and against the right of other citizens to use public infrastructure to go about their business. The suggestion was that potentially maybe organisations would have a certain number of protests before, if they continue to do them, well, there would be a need for them to be sent the bill. Well, interestingly, the New South Wales government swatted this one away before lunchtime today. However, Chris Minns has been open that there is a chance of a debate in Parliament somewhere about trying to work out where is the line and when you cross it, who pays for it. Here he was on 2GB.
But I want to make sure that my ducks are in a row. I'm not ruling out legislation. I realise that will be controversial. But I think even a lot of people that were at the protest on Sunday would appreciate that you can't knock the bridge out every weekend.
Now, back to the theme of saying the quiet part out loud. Jim Chalmers, of course, the State Charmer, the Treasurer, the man who is going to be having the 3-day talk fest, where the final item on the final day is the only thing really anyone cares about, which is the changes potentially to a tax system. You've heard from the union bosses and what they have demanded, which is huge changes, particularly to negative gearing and a whole bunch of other taxes that would raise more money than any of the taxes that were being suggested and rejected by the Australian people by Bill Shorten back in 2019. It means the Productivity Summit is now getting a new name, and this is a smart one from Tim Wilson. Everyone else in the opposition, pick up this line and run with it, please.
So far, all we've had is proposals for tax hikes. It's a tax hike summit from Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Initially it was a productivity one. It's now ended up being a tax hike summit. The unions have very clearly outlined their agenda.
And doing his bit in his new job as the Assistant Treasurer, Dan Molino, an MP from Victoria, was here on Sky News discussing this very issue today. And he's playing the game of I'm not going to rule anything in, I'm not going to rule anything out, which means when suggestions are put on the table about the GST, that they remain potentially active until they're either endorsed or killed off. Here's what he had to say, and pay attention to one word that starts with E towards the end of his comments.
Now, what the Treasurer has said from the outset is that he doesn't want to get into the rule-in, rule-out game because that would undermine the whole purpose of this process. And so he's open to a range of ideas being brought to the round table. It's also important to consider, when you look at a range of taxes, the equity of different taxes and also the administrative simplicity of different taxes and their fiscal implications. That's what makes tax reform complex, but you can't just look at that one characteristic of taxes in isolation.
Now, I'm hardly somebody who polices grammar. I'm not somebody who speaks the King's English, and don't get me to spell half of the words that I've just said to you tonight. But there is a grand difference between the concept of equality, one that we have all been very aware of for decades and decades, and the new prominence on the word equity. The word equity is different than the word equality, because equity means, regardless of your effort, we all end up in the same place. Or as Kamala Harris explains it,
it's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place.
You know, how did that work out? Of course, they won one and then they lost one big. There is a big difference between those two words. Pay attention when they are said because they mean very different things. Now, to our mates in Tasmania, I'm looking forward to being in Tassie sooner rather than later. We've got an Our Town coming up there in just a few weeks' time. But, of course, we care about Tasmania because it's a beautiful part of Australia. It's part of the family. And while I may well have wanted to talk an awful lot about Tasmanian state politics, I am aware it doesn't play that hot around the country. As you know, they have had an election, and guess what? Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. That's, of course, the Senate, not the Tasmanian Parliament. But anyway, here we go. So after the election, which was only brought on because the Labor Party basically tried to steal government, Jeremy Ratcliffe did an incredible job of being able to hold on to as many seats as he had going into the state election, and he is in the box seat to be the, returned Premier. But he only got 14 seats, which means he is 4 short of what you would need to control the Parliament. Dean Winter, who actually got a lower vote than some other candidates in his own electorate under the Hare-Clark system, had Labor with just 10 seats. They are 8 short of being able to become the government. But because of the Greens, that's an extra 5, because the former Lambie MPs have now been replaced with largely left-wing independents. There is a way that he could stitch his way towards 18 votes. But there could be quite a bit of mess between now and then. In fact, today was the day when all of the results became official, where the writs had been returned and the paperwork was done about the Tasmanian election. Now, under their constitution, the person with the most number of seats will be given the first opportunity to form a government. That will be Jeremy Ratcliffe, meaning he will be returned as the Premier. But whether his premiership lasts any longer than a month will all be down to what happens in the Parliament. Will there be another no confidence motion? Will there be another way of trying to change a government without actually having an election to change a government? That looks like exactly what is about to take place in Tasmania, yet again. Now, Jeremy Ratcliffe and I have had our disagreements, but I tell you what, he was as straight as an arrow during this campaign. He was as straight as an arrow, and Labor, who put all of this on, was not rewarded. In fact, their vote went down, one of the worst they have had in a century. The only thing that props them up is the Greens or very left-leaning independents, all of which, just one, throwing the toys out of the cot would mean off to an election again. So Tassie, I love you. I can't wait to hang out with you. But my goodness, your state politics is very difficult to deal with sometimes. Now, before we get to the debate tonight, I want to give a bit of extra time to it because everyone's going to be in the man cave. Let's talk about the Australian of the day. Let's talk about a person who is absolutely iconic, and one day, just one day, I have a feeling that they will tell tales about this person. They may even paint a mural somewhere or bugger it. Let's use all of what they were going to build the Daniel Andrews statue out of and build it to this bloke. Because how's this? The Aussie of the day today is a guy who made news like this.
A Maui dad has ditched his ute for a horse to save money on petrol.
What? He's going to the bottle-o in a horse. Now, obviously, the footage is going to be cool, but how do you put words around this? Let's watch a reporter try.
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But if you lead a horse to Bottle Mart, it can help you buy one. Just watch as Fox waits patiently for Ethan White to pay and pocket a couple of cans on his way home from a trip to Kmart with his daughter.
Mwah. Mwah. What a story. Well, OK, no more mucking around. Let's hear from this bloke, the Aussie of the day, talking about the Bottle-O and Kmart in one story.
There's nothing like going to Kmart to get hair ties and blue tack on horseback and everyone runs out and goes, hey, look at this horse.
Who doesn't love this bloke? Ethan, give me a little more where that came from.
It cost me nothing to ride him up the street. And it makes people smile and it makes people happy and joyful and everyone stops and says hello and nobody does that when you're driving a car.
How good is that?